One of the most curious anecdotes about John Ronald Reuel Tolkien is recounted by the scholar Clyde Samuel Kilby in his 1976 book Tolkien and the Silmarillion. Hidden away in a footnote, he recalls the following conversation. I was invited to dinner with some of the faculty at Christ Church, and afterwards one member asked me if the Silmarillion had any sex in the modern sense in it. Next day I mentioned this to Tolkien, and to my surprise he said he had written a couple of sex stories, though he did not volunteer to show them to me. Now, if you know anything about Tolkien, you'll know that he was a conservative Catholic who seemed to shy away from any direct mentions of sexuality. This was a time when standards around obscenity in literature were a lot stricter than today, but even then, you just need to look at contemporary fantasy writers like the descriptions of casual sex in the books of E.R. Edison, or the necrophilic shenanigans in the stories of Clark Ashton Smith, to see that they got away with being a lot more explicit about sex than the Lord of the Rings ever got. You could also look at the medieval literature that Tolkien spent his academic career studying, which operates at a whole other level. So, even by the standards of his day, J.R.R. Tolkien was regarded as rather prudish. In that case, how do we explain the conversation that Kilby recounts here? What are these sex stories that don't seem to be referenced anywhere in Tolkien's letters or in any other biographical studies? The way I see it, there's 4 possibilities. 1. A story in the published legendarium. If we actually look through all of Tolkien's writings that were published posthumously in the Silmarillion, or Unfinished Tales, or the 12-volume History of Middle-earth, or The Nature of Middle-earth, can we find anything that could be characterized as a sex story? There's definitely plenty of love stories, Beren and Luthien, Tor and Idril, Arendil and Elwing, whatever you want to call what was going on between Turin and Niniel, but all of these are high romance. There's no mention of physical desire as a factor in these relationships, and it's only by the fact that each of them produced children that we can even infer that the relationships were consummated at all. Within the Legendarium, carnal lust is the domain of villainous characters, Eöl, Maegleen, or especially the Dark Lord Morgoth. In the Silmarillion, we even have a description of him engaging in what I can best describe as gooning when he first sees Luthien. But that's just one brief scene. For our purposes, did Tolkien ever write an entire story centered around sex? Well, the closest thing to that is probably Aldarion and Arendis, the Mariner's Wife, published in the Unfinished Tales. It's a somewhat uncharacteristic story that has very little to do with the epic conflict between good and evil, and much more with messy interpersonal relationships. Aldarion is a Númenórean prince who enjoys venturing off to sea, so much so that he neglects pretty much all of his other duties, including getting a wife and producing an heir. But eventually, he marries a noblewoman Arendis, who is deeply infatuated with him due to his physical beauty, and they produce a daughter, Enkallame. But even after he gets married and inherits the throne, Aldarion's main love is still for the sea. He leaves Arendis for long stretches of time, and in her loneliness she grows increasingly bitter, and eventually refuses to share her bed with him. This is around where the story cuts off. It is an unfinished tale after all, but we do have Tolkien's notes for how he intended for the rest of it to go. Arendis passes on her bitterness to Enkallame, who grows up despising men, thinking, all things were made for their service. Hills are for quarries, rivers to furnish water or to turn wheels, trees for boards, women for their body's need. She is eventually convinced to marry a nobleman named Halacar, but their relationship is unhappy. She becomes so resentful that she forbids even her serving women from getting married, much to their own dissatisfaction. They take on secret lovers, and the story reaches its climax with Halacar arranging for them all to get married in a surprise ceremony without Enkallame's permission, with an observation that there will be a great many beddings that night, but Enkallame will be sleeping all alone. Tolkien scholar Tylus describes this as the quintessential Tolkien sex story, one in which hardly any sex takes place, and yet all the actions are influenced by desire unfulfilled or withheld. And ultimately comes together in a moral about the importance of healthy sexual relationships, taking place entirely, of course, within the institution of marriage. This is probably the strongest contender for any of Tolkien's writings that could be considered a sex story, but most of you probably find it disappointing. Unfulfilled desire is definitely a major theme, but it's largely left to the reader's interpretation whether that desire is primarily physical or emotional, and the cardinal act itself is only obliquely referenced a few times throughout the story. Did Tolkien ever get more explicit when writing about sex? Well, actually yes. Laws and Customs Among the Eldar is an essay published in Morgoth's Ring, where Tolkien writes in length about the culture of the elves, and where he couldn't help but dipping into a bit of detail about their sex lives. Now, this is an unfinished essay that has a lot of details that are contradicted in later stories, so there's a lot of debate over how much of it can be considered to be canonical. But that being said, we're told that elves do have a libido, that when they have sex they are automatically considered to be married, that their sex drive fades away after they've had a few children, and they are incapable of sexual violence. They are essentially designed to be the ideal type of person from the standpoint of Catholic sexual morality. And this was the most explicit lore we got about the subject until 2021, when The Nature of Middle-earth was published. This is essentially a collection of short essays that Tolkien never got around to finishing, so again, we can't really say that any of these ideas are necessarily canon, but in a section about elven life cycles, we are given the most vivid description to date about elven procreation. It was one of the acts of chief delight in process and in memory in an elven life, but its intensity alone provided its importance, not its time or length. It could not have been endured for a greater length of time without disastrous expense. But back to the original point, have we found anything here that we could call a sex story? Well, we found at least one story where sexual fulfillment is a major theme, though it's presented in an oblique manner, and we have some essays where sex is discussed explicitly, though only briefly. We don't know what Tolkien himself meant when using the term sex story, so it's possible that these fit the bill. But I imagine that most of you would consider these stories to be rather underwhelming, which leads to the next possibility: a secret, unpublished story. I first became aware of these supposed sex stories through a Reddit post by user Honkoku, and the comment section of this post is mostly taken up by speculation about sexually explicit stories that either Tolkien later destroyed or were hidden away by his estate after his death. This is a type of claim that's impossible to definitively prove or disprove, but can we assess whether it's at least plausible? Based on everything we know about Tolkien, it seems like he would have been too prudish to write anything more explicit than the stories we've already discussed. But then again, all of us contain multitudes. He would hardly be the first person in history who put up a conservative, respectable facade to hide a freakier side. But if these stories exist, would they be so thoroughly hidden away for decades? The Tolkien estate, run by his descendants, has been eager to publish just about everything he ever wrote, up to the point that, as we've seen, they're filling up books with short, fragmentary essays. If there's full, completed stories out there that they are refusing to publish, then the contents must be pretty scandalous indeed. And if that's the case, why would Tolkien casually mention the existence of these stories to Clyde Kilby, a random American professor, but as far as we know, never indicate their existence anywhere else to any other person? It seems unlikely, but it does suggest another possibility. 3. Kilby was making it up. The only account we have of these supposed sex stories comes from a book written by Clyde Kilby that came out 3 years after Tolkien's death. We can't rule out the possibility that he was lying, or perhaps severely misremembering. Now, for context, Clyde Kilby was a professor of English at Wheaton College, who was one of the first people to study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis at an academic level. His book Tolkien and the Silmarillion was written based on a summer he spent in Oxford, during which time he interacted extensively with Tolkien, and was one of the few people that was allowed to read segments of the Silmarillion before its publication. So, could he be making any of this up? Well, by all accounts I can find, he was a respected scholar who wasn't known for sensationalism, and the anecdote in question, again, was hidden away in a footnote. If Kilby was making this up for attention, I would think that he would put it more front and center. So, it seems to me at least that this interaction really did happen, but to explain it, there is our final possibility. 4. Tolkien was making it up. A lot of the time when people talk about J.R.R. Tolkien, they talk about his strict attention to detail when creating the Legendarium. They talk about how he was a crotchety old man who disliked everything about the modern world. They talk about his devout Catholicism, and this can make him come off as a rather stodgy, dour person. However, from the accounts of people who actually knew him, he seems to have been actually rather jovial. He was someone who very much enjoyed joking around with friends, and who had a bit of a penchant for practical jokes. Former Oxford student Norman Power recalls a time when Tolkien pulled out a small green shoe that he had in his pocket for some reason, and tried to convince the audience of undergraduates that this proved the existence of leprechauns. And, more alarmingly, Tolkien's biographer Humphrey Carpenter claims that he had a habit of dressing up as an Anglo-Saxon warrior and chasing his neighbors around while wielding an axe. So, with that in mind, I can easily imagine a scenario where Clyde Kilby, knowing full well that the answer is going to be no, decides to ask Tolkien, "Hey, did you write any sex stories in the Silmarillion?" And just to see the look on his face, Tolkien lies and says, "Oh yeah, I've written loads of them. You're not allowed to see them though," thinking that this would just be a funny thing to say in the moment, having no idea that this would stick in Kilby's memory long enough that he'd write it down in a book. And people would still be speculating about it half a century later. Or at least, that's the version of the story that makes the most sense to me. Maybe he was referring to Aldarion and Arendis. Maybe Kilby was just making it up. Maybe Tolkien did write some secret erotica that's hiding away in a vault somewhere. But unless the Tolkien estate comes out with a surprise release, we'll never know for sure. So, until the next time, I guess. And if you find the lack of Tolkien sex stories to be disappointing, then you'll be glad to know that there's a website called archiveofurown.org, where there are entire teams of people working to remedy the problem. If you need something to scratch that itch, then believe me, there is no shortage of content.